only who are experts on things, but who you really want to hear speak on things. And these two certainly fit the bill for me. And it's also an incredibly timely type of presentation. We couldn't have timed it any better or worse, if you want to put it that way, because all of the strategies that they're thinking about for unaccompanied minors, they're considering, they're proposing, are the kinds of strategies that Michael has spoken about in his really interesting paper, which is the excuse for this gathering. It just seems like whenever there's a migration crisis or any kind of increase in unauthorized migration, the strategies are always the exact same. More border enforcement, you get other states to keep people from reaching your territorial boundaries, and you increase detention wholesale. Those three things, and certainly those are themes of Michael's paper. I first met Michael Flynn, I think almost 20 years ago. It was rather amazing. This guy who was the editor for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists shows up, right? And I think that bulletin was associated with the University of Chicago at that time, wasn't it? Yeah. And he's writing this incredible article on U.S. migrant interception programs. And we all knew about the interdiction by sea programs at that point, what the Coast Guard was doing, but we had no idea that the U.S. was funding Mexico and various Central American countries to actually keep people from reaching the border. This was before that expanded border concept of post 9/11 became clear to everybody. And who knew, who knew that the atomic scientists were so interested in immigration issues? It was kind of amazing to find that out. So since then, Michael has gone on and done various things, and he's now the founder and the director of the Global Detention Project. And that project is an interdisciplinary research initiative that investigates the role of detention in state responses to global migration, and it particularly focuses on detention policies and physical infrastructure. And I really highly commend Michael's work to you. He's a great scholar. He writes like a journalist, which means he's a very interesting and kind of elegant writer. And the Global Detention Project, it keeps this incredible, is growing this incredible database of detention practices from around the world. And they do these terrific summaries of detention practices and detention infrastructure and policies in countries throughout the world. So I think that, please look at his website, and please, I subscribe to it, and I'd recommend that other people do that as well. And like I said, the excuse for this event is that he has submitted a paper which is going to be published later this week by our journal on migration and human security on the global diffusion of detention is an immigration enforcement tool. And the paper covers the spread of detention and the externalization of immigration enforcement policies globally, with a particular focus on this global trend and the U.S.'s role in this global trend over, say, the last 30 years or so, although it goes back beyond that, but it particularly covers the last 30 years. We think it's a groundbreaking paper, and we certainly encourage you to read it. And if you don't already subscribe to our journal, you can subscribe online, or you can let us know if you'd like to receive it, and we'll sign you up and send it to you. We're also very, very fortunate today to have Dr. Dora Schriro with us. Dora is a rare kind of special person in the immigration field, and in particular the immigrant detention field, for three main reasons. First, she's the only person ever to have directed a state correctional agency, and that would be Arizona and Connecticut, and a city correctional agency, which is New York City. And on top of that, she was the head of the reform effort at Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security related to the U.S. immigrant detention system. So she's incredibly well qualified to kind of speak on these issues. She's also an attorney and has been a key member of the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration. And she's a scholar who's widely published and an acknowledged expert on these issues. Her position at DHS was as special advisor to Janet Napolitano on immigration and customs enforcement and detention and removal. And she was the founding director of the Office of Detention Policy and Planning for DHS, and was the person that first kind of shed a light in a very significant way on the US detention system and conceptualized and jump-started detention reform in the United States. She wrote, I think in 2009, the very best and most thorough critique of this system. So we have two real experts here. We're going to ask Michael to speak on his paper for 20 minutes or 25 minutes. We're in no rush here. And then we'll ask Dora to both respond to Michael's talk, but also speak to greater length about her work at DHS and the key ingredients to successful reform and management successfully of the detention function. And because we always have such great people, including you all, we're going to try to leave at least half of our time for question and dialogue at the end of this. So let me turn it over to Michael now, and again, thank these two for being here with us.
Don, thank you for that very generous introduction. That brings back some memories of that presentation 20 years ago.
Right.
Some of the material that he mentioned actually is in the paper that will be published later this week. It's a very long paper, so they were very generous in allowing me to write at length. But because it's such a long paper, I'm not going to be able to discuss all the elements of it, but I'm going to highlight a few key issues and some examples that illustrate what I'm talking about. And then I'll leave it at that, and we can explore more of the issues in the Q&A later. Among the issues that I would, the paper is titled There and Back Again on the Diffusion of Immigration Detention. And three key aspects of the paper are, number one, it applies diffusion theory to demonstrate the variety of mechanisms that have helped encourage the growth of detention practices globally. For those of you not familiar with diffusion, the literature on diffusion, it's in effect, its core concern is to develop theoretical models that explain how policies spread between countries or between different social groups. So I adopt, I'll go into that a little bit later. The second key point that I would like to highlight is the geographical scope of the article. I focus on the Americas, Australasia, and Europe, highlighting how dominant countries in each of these regions have endeavored to copy each other's policies. And in turn, encourage the growth of detention regimes in countries on their peripheries. And it's a very interconnected phenomenon, as I'll try to demonstrate. And in the process of highlighting what's happened in these geographic regions over the last 20 to 30 years, I highlight in the paper some of the lesser well-known aspects of externalization that we see in these regions. While, as Don pointed out, the issue of the Caribbean interdiction efforts by the United States is well known and well analyzed, other aspects, like the issue of trying to interdict and detain migrants as far away as Guatemala or Ecuador, are lesser well known. So I highlight some key examples from that. Additionally, I talk about some of the policies, some of the ways in which these countries, these main countries, these leading countries have learned from each other, some of these strategies, and how those strategies have had impacts that were not foreseen and often not even recognized in the literature or by policymakers or even in the journalism or the press. With respect to diffusion theory, if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the model that I develop or that I adopt, I encourage you to read the paper when it comes out. But a few things that I can point out about it. I adopt a model that's been developed by a Swiss scholar named Sandra Lavenex, who has written extensively on how the EU is able to successfully export some detention and immigration control models to third countries outside the EU. And she describes a number of different mechanisms by which that happens. The three that are probably most relevant for the paper include a model she calls unilateral emulation, which is where states learn the apparent utility of new policies by seeing other countries do it. There's no pressure to do so. There's simply a learning process, and they, as a result of what they've seen elsewhere, adapted to respond to their own complex situations that emerge. The second model is called adoption through externality. And this occurs when states adopt new policies to respond to situations that are in effect imposed upon them because of the adoption of policies by their neighbors. And we'll see that repeatedly in the history of the evolution of detention practices globally. The third main category that applies here is the policy transfer through conditionality, in which we see states applying pressure on neighboring countries to adopt policies using all kinds of different carrots and sticks to achieve the policy outcomes that they want to see. And this is a very important model to keep in mind when we think about why countries as far away as Mauritania have developed policies that they previously did not have. There's no evidence that they applied detention at all. So that's what I'll say on diffusion. If you want to see some more about how I developed the models for the paper, I encourage you to read the paper. But I'm happy to take questions on that later. The second area is the geographical regions that I choose to focus on. And I choose the Americas, Europe, and the Asia Pacific because when you analyze their policy deliberations over the last 20 to 30 years, you see how they successfully learned from each other key offshore strategies and adopted them because they looked and saw it. And this sort of emulation has been critical in this process of the expansion of certain kinds of forms of detention, in particular the use of offshore detention facilities. Thus, for example, one of the key, when you look at the history of this, you see that the United States was an early innovator with the use of Guantanamo and some other facilities offshore. And this particular use of facilities was expressly referred to in the Australian Parliament when they were deliberating the Pacific solution. They saw that the United States was doing this, and they said, let's do it ourselves. And that evolves into the Pacific solution, which I'm sure you're all aware of. In terms of, among some other notable cases in terms of how why I focus on this region is because each time these countries learned from each other certain strategies, these strategies always fall short of expectations. They never succeed fully. And so inevitably, they seek additional ways to impose this effort to control migration beyond their borders, leading them, in all cases, in Europe, in the United States, and Australia, to encourage, fund, support detention operations in other countries. The case of Mauritania is particularly telling in this regard because before 2006, there's no indication that Mauritania detained anybody for immigration-related reasons. But because Mauritania became a key transit point for migrants from throughout sub-Saharan Africa who were using it to get on boats to go to the Canary Islands, Frontex, the European Union's effort to do border control, they control boats, they manage efforts to interdict migrants throughout the Mediterranean and down the coast of Africa. They were interdicting people and sending them back to Mauritania. And Mauritania was faced with a situation. What does it do with these detainees? And the Spanish government stepped in and started funding a detention center, one of which was aptly called by advocates El Guantanamito. One of the things that we see in each of the issues of this diffusion of immigration detention, repeatedly in all the regions, is that it raises a number of questions both with respect to the rights of the detainees and also who has custody over them. Who has custody, who's controlling the facility, it's often not clear. And these are endemic in each of these examples. The third point that I want to highlight are some of the lesser well-known aspects of externalization. With respect to the United States, I'm sure many of you are aware of the global reach strategy that was launched by the Clinton administration in 1997, which was described by the Justice Department as a strategy of combating illegal immigration through emphasis on overseas deterrence. A lot of people have written and discussed this particular strategy and how it evolved, but one of the things that's not necessarily well known is the impact this strategy had in other countries. Don referred to it briefly in his introduction. In the case of Guatemala, Guatemala found itself with thousands of people being detained in a purportedly anti-smuggling operation, which probably resulted in the apprehension of 10 migrant smugglers, people smugglers, but thousands of undocumented migrants. What could they do with these people? And it's the same thing that we see in Mauritania. In this case, the Guatemalan authorities appealed to the U.S. Embassy for funding to run 2 dilapidated hotels in Guatemala City to detain these people, many of whom were from as far away as South Asia. This was not at all reported in the United States. It received no attention whatsoever. It received a small paragraph in the Miami Herald, page 10, in 2001, after one of the detainees committed suicide. And that was the extent of the coverage of this. But this kind of policy is a direct result of the fact that other deterrence efforts did not achieve the outcome, so the United States adopted a policy strategy, and the results of that adoption of that strategy created a need by Guatemala to innovate. And what did they do? They asked the United States for money. They started opening up some former hotels for this purpose. In Europe, it's been very well analyzed, the externalization of immigration controls in the European region. I don't know to what extent many of you are familiar with this conversation in Europe, but what's not well known is, for instance, in Europe, we see that when they were looking back as early as the early 2000s, they started proposing, the UK and other states, let's build offshore processing facilities like Australia did in the Pacific Solution, which Australia did, modeling the United States. They never successfully adopted, or not to date, they haven't adopted this particular model. But what they have done is use a lot of other mechanisms to encourage detention in countries in their periphery. And one of the mechanisms I would highlight is the twinning process, which is a process by which the European Union gives money to candidate states to bolster their infrastructure and their institutions to prepare them for membership in the EU. Millions of dollars, for example, have been earmarked for boosting Turkey's detention infrastructure through the twinning process. And in addition, Turkey has just signed with the EU a readmission agreement, which is language many of you may not be familiar with if you're not in the European context, but readmission agreements are in effect agreements that the EU makes with neighboring countries to accept the nationals from that country, but also people who presumably transited that country en route to Europe. These readmitted people, these readmitted third country nationals, are inevitably detained. So Turkey has recently agreed to this with Europe. And so you will see thousands of people returned to Turkey. And where will they be detained? These are some of the processes and phenomena that I describe in the article. The final thing I'd just like to highlight, and this probably goes without saying, each of these efforts, this expanding detention phenomena, as it were, has resulted in significant challenges in the rights of these people and the ability of migrants and asylum seekers from accessing specific rights. A key one that comes up, for instance, is the right to be detained according to law. And many of these countries where the United States, Europe, Australia have supported expanding detention regimes, it's very difficult to find what law is being used, which increases in very obvious ways the vulnerability of the people detained. And very importantly, the encouragement in these other countries to detain people is also resulting in people being detained in situations that are appalling. That's all I'll say for now, but thank you for listening.
Thank you.
So imagine following that. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity, Don. It's great to be here and to be a part of a really important conversation. I had the opportunity to read the draft. I'm sworn to secrecy, though, and I will not give you my copy. But what I'd like to do is build on what I anticipated Michael's remarks to be, and to shape my remarks into three fast buckets for you. It's under the first is just to reflect a little bit about ICE, which is the American story when it comes to large-scale interdiction and detention and otherwise management of people who are in this country. And so I want to share with you some of my early findings and then some of my more recent thinking about the way in which ICE has approached its task. The second part is to just touch briefly on my reflections about the private sector and its impact on decision-making. My view may be a little bit different than yours, but it should be some food for thought. And then last, as time allows, is just to look at the angst that is going on now with this, not sudden by any means, but suddenly on our radar screen of the influx of unaccompanied minors who are entering the United States, mostly from the south, but a little bit from the north, and reflect about the extent to which we've learned any lessons in the first several years of immigration reform. So for me, when I had the chance to read Michael's work, I come in at it a little bit differently, in part because I've been in government most of my life, running largely state, but also fairly recently a federal organization, and so where countries will articulate a policy, and the most notable one that happened recently in the United States was the shift in policy from catch and release to catch and remove. Remove, that is, return to their place of origin. That how government, those who carry out the direction of the policymaker, in our case, elected policymakers, it interprets the message, and in interpreting the message, it sometimes changes the message, or at least amplifies the message. And so that gets me to the first part of the conversation about ICE as a part of the Department of Homeland Security, as well as Customs and Border Patrol, how it is that they approach the work that they do. And so whether the United States government was influenced by other governments, I think we were somewhat at the forefront of making this decision about how we were going to deal with individuals who had either come unlawfully or stayed past their lawful time limit. So we may have provided leadership there, not necessarily in a good way, but when it came to the opportunity to revisit and reform that system, so it is that we had a real opportunity to again provide some leadership that could have been emulated. And so to the extent that we've moved these reforms is the extent to which perhaps we've been able to shape and reshape that conversation, which is subtext for let's get this thing rebooted as best we can. In my report, which was a combination of both statistical analysis but also qualitative analysis, being something of the ethnographer, going into 25 facilities more than once, many of them around the country, observing similar phenomena, reoccurring on a regular basis, and from this formed these categories for thinking and further analysis. The couple that I want to talk about, first is population management, and the next is detention management, and last is accountability, which is everything to do with transparency and commitment to excellence. But population management is most fundamentally, so you get this mandate, we're going to catch and then we're going to remove. And so what does that look like? Because much of what we react to is certainly the policy in its broadest sense, but it's also how that policy is carried out. And so being the jailer, if you will, for much of my career, and recognizing almost immediately that what ICE had done is to emulate, or think that they were emulating, what goes on in the correctional arena, that much of the practice that you see with the civilly detained population is a crossover from corrections. I'll just pause for a moment. There's a great anthropological study that I think every first year anthropologist reads, and it's something of the study of the Nasarima. Nasarima is actually American spelled backwards. But it's about when you're watching something, if you come in from another culture and you're watching something, it's like you're watching it, but you don't know any part of it means. And so in that little kind of expose, they have someone, going through these crazy rituals. They look at them in a looking glass, and they have a sharp instrument, and they scrape their face with it. And, they write it in this very objective way as if they don't understand what they're seeing. And sometimes that's how I felt watching an enforcement agency focused on removal engaged in the process of detention without any of the guidance of considerable years of case law that have come to shape and make more humane the practices that are in the correctional arena, and which is not to say that we still don't have quite the ways to go. So in response to your, what is the law, whose law is it, there is very little law that governs civil detention, which is part of the difficulty. So population management is most fundamentally how you translate the policy into practice. And so asked another way in the context of detention is, so it's the continuum and the conditions of control. So what kind of facilities, hardened facilities with what kinds of characteristics, what are the entrance and exit requirements. So the conditions and continuums of control, and most fundamentally it's policy and procedures from the least to the most restrictive. And it's what we've seen, over the years that by and large the conditions of supervision and incarceration have been far more restrictive than the risk that the population has presented in terms of day-to-day management. So there is risk, but it's more of a political and a politicized nature. And so the things that are clearly lacking at the time of the study, and to some extent today, is that whether or not expectations have been laid out for managers and line staff who are going to carry out the policies of ICE, who are carrying out the direction of the executive, the staffing levels, the determination about what decisions are made at a centralized level versus at some regional basis or facility by facility, the extent to which there's technology to assist in assessment and communication, like who's in the population today and where are they located, to develop standards that are not copycatted from the correctional arena, but that again are tailored to meet the unique needs and requirements of a civilly detained population. So this continuum of control applies to whether you're talking about detention facilities or if you're talking about alternatives to detention. There being some electronic supervision having been part of the ICE strategy from the beginning, but much like the correctional world which they copy from, with the tendency to over-supervise, to over-incarcerate, electronic monitoring is frequently used more often than needed, as was detention, whether it be civil or criminal as well. And so you've got these built-in problems which carry over because of the lack of fundamental understanding about what the risk is, how to assess the risk, and then how to best manage it. Now, in contrast, detention management versus population management is actually how you're going to operate those facilities. So how do they look? How are they staffed? What are the programming opportunities? To what extent is again, going back to a sociological model, total institutions, where total institutions, the decision makers make all the decisions. So even what you wear and what you eat and where you go and when you go and with whom you sleep, those most fundamental choices, they infuse the day-to-day management of the facilities and also leave us with our assessments about how humane and how appropriate these management strategies are. The last piece, the accountability, is how transparent we are about the decision making that we have and how well we do what we do. And so as I've had continued to stay actively involved in the field, but have some distance by not being involved directly in ICE activities now for several years, the way that I've come to look at this is with three more global concepts, and that's the fundamental competency of the organization, the capacity of the organization, and then most basically the commitment of the organization. So I took 7 buckets and shrunk them into 3 larger pots, if you will. And so the capacity, again, is the organization's infrastructure, its policies and procedures, the physical plant, the extent to which the physical plant is congruent with its policies and procedures, is it in sync or not, and just the way in which we interact with the population, the way in which we perceive their needs and their risks, and the way in which we respond to them. Competency is the extent to which the system, in this case, both civil detention and alternatives to civil detention, the way in which we are consistently at our optimal proficiency. So to what extent do we realize both an effective system and an efficient system? And so a competent system focuses on outcomes, not on outputs. So it's not so much what we do, but how we do it, and whether or not we achieve our desired result. Competency also speaks to the organization's resiliency, its willingness to look at itself, to evaluate how well it's doing what it's doing, to stop and make improvements, whether they be in increments or sea change as needed. And of course that links right back to its capacity. Commitment speaks to the broader community. It's certainly commitment within the body that's performing this work, whether it's public sector, as I've been speaking, or private sector, or public and private together as partners. But the commitment speaks to something much bigger. It speaks to all of us who are in this community, the community, whether it's state by state decision making or nation by nation. And so to the extent that we have a system that we like or dislike, speaks fundamentally to our commitment to continue to weigh in, whether it be from the outside or from the inside. I'm just going to toggle over real fast, if I can, to reflect for a moment about public versus private. I've seen the private sector for a number of years, because the private sector has been active in the corrections arena, both when it comes to operating privately owned and or operated prisons at the state and even for the Bureau of Prisons, but also because the private sector is involved in alternatives to incarceration as well. And specific to ICE, the private sector actually has had 3 major roles, not only running detention facilities on behalf of ICE in a number of instances, but also providing all of the alternative to incarceration supervision and electronic equipment monitoring associated with that, and also to provide ongoing evaluations for ICE as to how well ICE was doing, which is subtext for how well the private sector is doing. And so it's interesting. You have one private vendor evaluating how other private vendors are doing. But it goes back to the competency and the capacity and the commitment umbrellas that I've been referencing. If what ICE has sorely lacked at the time of the study, and to some significant extent still, is because this is not its primary mission. It is fundamentally an enforcement agency and not an agency that's involved in in detention on a temporary basis or alternatives as well. If you don't know what you want and you don't know how to get it and you don't know whether or not you got it, it's really difficult to meet the mandate that the executive has articulated, and so creating capacity, creating and sustaining competency, and fundamentally being true to that core mission, to the commitment to excellence, in part to affirming, in large measure to affirming human rights, as well as being fiscally prudent and in compliance with the laws to the extent that they exist, to be lawful in all things as a lawful nation, that this is why the private sector is critical. But the private sector is not the problem. And there was a time where I wasn't sure that I could ever think that or say that, but I believe it to be the case. ICE utilizes as many sheriff's departments as it uses private facilities, and in many cases you have a blended approach where actually sheriffs built facilities that they have then turned over to the private sector to operate on behalf of the sheriffs that are now filled with ICE detainees, and so the sheriff's department has in their view, for the most part, and always generalities are going to get us into some trouble, but they're elected by their own community, and but when they agree to take on a federal mission, and then you have a private sector doing the interpretation, it continues to always go back to ICE, to government in the context of the conversation of the United States. We have to know what we want, we have to know how we want it delivered, and we have to know whether or not we got it, and then be clear about, or find the ways about, if we didn't get what we expected, to prepare to make those changes to realize the goals that we've set for ourselves. So we have both another challenge and another opportunity now that we grapple with unaccompanied minors. And here you have a blend, not just with the Department of Homeland Security, but Health and Human Services, which through Congress some years ago parceled out unaccompanied minors to be the day-to-day responsibility of OR within HHS. How's that for an alphabet? And but because they share that mission, the removal piece or the relief piece with Homeland Security, now you have two cultures under one mandate who are looking to make sense about how to deliver this. So HHS traditionally focusing on foster placements and small facilities, now grappling with very large numbers of youth. And so will they keep with the HHH model, or out of necessity, or perhaps for other reasons, will they look for facilities and strategies that look more like what we've come to see being utilized for the adult population, if for no other reason than the sheer numbers, is now both our opportunity and our challenge. And as part of that community, we can all weigh in and should weigh in to have it come out the way we want it to be. Thank you.
So I thought I would start with a kind of a broader question before we get to your questions and comments, and it has to do with this issue of, which is very much on everybody's mind now, this issue of how is it that whenever there's an increase or a perceived crisis in migration, what you call, I think in your paper, a moral panic, right?
I believe
Oh, he's eliminated, sorry, the language of moral panic, which was edited out of Michael's paper. But the default is always, let's push the borders out, let's externalize enforcement policies, let's, to the extent that people can reach the borders, let's fund more border enforcement. And the linchpin of all that being detention then, detention overseas, abroad, detention in the United States, detention on the border. And so why is that? And the more I think about it, I just wanted to kind of test this with you. I'm always struck at the inability or the difficulty that people have that don't like those policies, myself included, to speak about affirmatively the benefits of migration and then persuasively on kind of meaningful options to that whole regime, that default regime. And I'm totally about, kind of detention reform and the need for it, and totally on board, but it seems to me that once you have that detention system in place, then you're kind of in the conversation on alternatives to detention, and are they really alternatives to detention, or are they just alternative forms of detention that actually expand detention capacity rather than decrease it? You're talking about conditions of detention then, and what conditions are appropriate, what models are appropriate. You're talking about mandatory versus voluntary detention, and executive discretion to release people. And so those are very, very hard things to, I'm going to say win on, and sound not objective in doing that, but those are hard conversations to have, and those are hard things to prevail on. And I wonder if you all, I know you've thought about this, kind of why is it that this has become, and partially, Michael, this is your paper, why have these ideas gotten such purchase and expanded as they have? Thank you.
There's a number of questions in there. I think the first question, why this default reaction to crises, as it were. I'm an academic, so I hide behind my academic shield and often don't propose policy solutions. But I would say that one of the reasons why the issue of immigration is so susceptible to extremes, as it were, is because in any political situation, if you're looking for, I think politics works in a sort of short feedback loop. You look for short-term political gain, and that will be done often by expressing problems with the group that is disenfranchised. And undocumented migrants are clearly disenfranchised from the start. So I think it's an easy target. I think that's number one. I think that when they have migration, I would like to avoid the use of the word crises, but when you have large-scale migration events, the way in which people perceive these events to be unfolding is in a state of crisis. And you see that clearly in the coverage of what's gone on with the children in the case of the United States. You see it repeatedly in Europe. Every summer there is a new wave of boats that are coming in. Europe feels invaded. And it's characterized that way. So that sets the stage for, I think, solutions that are lacking in the human element, as it were. So I think the vulnerability of this group of people makes them particularly susceptible to this kind of response. With respect to the alternatives to detention issue, and once you have a detention regime in place, and by regime I suppose that would include everything from the regulations and detention centers to the laws that provide for it, to the kinds of facilities that are being used. Once you have that in place, obviously it's very, very challenging to begin to push back against that or roll it back up. And we see that repeatedly in every country we look at the Global Detention Project. We see that in some cases the adoption or the effort by states to pursue certain kinds of norms, for instance, norms related to the proper disposition of detainees in custody, have led to new developments in terms of law and policy, the creation of new facilities, the establishment of facilities only for this purpose. And so it's had a sort of a unintended consequence in that this efforts to detain people correctly leads to detaining more people. And so once you create these institutions, they have a need to survive. In the same way that a private company, once it gets involved in something like this, has a need to survive and grow. And so there's institutional momentum. You could speak to that much more than I could, Dora, but we've seen this repeatedly. So it becomes very challenging to do something like an effective alternative to detention strategy for the very reason that this becomes window dressing instead of real reform. So as we see countries adopting and making a lot of noise about the adoption of alternatives, well, we don't see a concomitant decrease in the number of people detained, ever. There's one case I think we could highlight, maybe some of you are aware of the case in Belgium, where they adopted an alternative for families, which in effect said that we will no longer, in the first instance, ever detain families. So any alternative requires that step. We won't detain this group of people. And as a result, families were no longer detained. They were placed in houses in the community. But you have to pair the alternative with a prohibition, as it were, which is a very complicated thing to do. In the case of Belgium, they did it successfully, but the most recent information from Belgium is that they're backtracking because there is an they find the absconder rate to be unacceptable. So there's a few answers to some of the questions.
Thank you. I'm just always struck with the, particularly on this crisis, with the inability of people like myself and others to articulate. I mean, there's always that kind of recourse to root causes. Of course, this isn't the solution. We have to address the root causes, but nobody ever speaks persuasively about programs that are successfully addressing root causes, nor do they speak very persuasively about development. Maybe it's just a division in the way in which the world is siloed, our world of issues. But I think that that's really a glaring deficiency when it's clear that there's violence and rule of law and criminal impunity and, you know, all of those public institutions failing in certain countries that are driving a lot of this. Dora, let me follow up with you on that issue of privatization and Michael's point on is it true that you as a manager, particularly inheriting a bureaucracy that doesn't do corrections for a living, you know, does enforcement but not corrections and detention, and this thing has kind of grown up the way that it's grown up, helter-skelter, depend on private contractors because there's not a lot of expertise within the bureaucracy, and to the extent that you're contracting with people, there are people that are less responsive to you and less answerable to you even than the contractors. But is there a privatization concern related to the kind that Michael talked about, which is then you have their lobbyists working in 28 states and trying to kind of expand this system and trying to kind of be answerable to their stockholders rather than to the common good in the way that government should. And I don't know if the word political economy or the phrase political economy survived the article either, Michael, but there's it's still in there. Then there's a different political economy, as Michael put it in his article. So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'll sure try. So I don't pretend to be a spokesperson for anybody but myself, but so I won't pretend to know necessarily what the private sector thinks, as if they would think with one mind anyhow. But just going back to some of your preamble, my experiences in running organizations, and so always being involved in reforming them, is that it works best if you go backwards and forwards at the same time, that there's remedial work that you have to do even as you're envisioning and building something that's better than before. So you fix as best you can what you got as you're moving forward. And that's what I encouraged ICE to do then, and would give the same advice today. What I did learn about the private sector, working with them differently at Homeland than I had in the corrections arena before, is it was there to see all the time. It was my own failing that I didn't see it. But like you hear about in all of business, they don't like uncertainty. And ICE was something of a chaotic situation where, again, because it didn't have a clear vision or speak with one voice and lacked expertise, there were many changes that were being made on an ongoing basis. And I made a fast reference before about the lack of general organization within ICE, not articulating decisions that should be made centralized from headquarters so as to give some universal expectation versus some strategies that would be best executed on a regional basis and others best delivered at the local level. And so, because there were a lot of big decisions with dollars attached to them being made at both the local and the regional level and not centrally, and those decisions were changed frequently, so the cost of doing business was appreciably higher. And so it was a place where our inexperience cost taxpayers considerably. The private sector is interested in satisfying the customer. When the customer is government and you can articulate what you want, I have no doubt that they will do their best to deliver, because that's how they stay in business. Likewise, if the customer is technically a sheriff who retained the services of the private sector, as I mentioned before, I think it's much more difficult to make those changes. Some of the things that aren't done well in corrections carry over when they're applied to the civil side. And so how much supervision is enough supervision, and which people should be done that. And so developing better, more objectively based evidence-informed decision-making tools is really critical to the practice, because many people need no supervision at all, that they can be assessed to have a failure to appear rate to be low, and so to place them in the community with some conditions or no conditions will turn out to be reliably high. And it sounds like where that isn't the case, then they either didn't develop those tools or they abandoned using them for one reason or another over time. But we are risk aversive as a nation, and so it is, I think, in part why we over-incarcerate and over-supervise. And so those very same cultural characteristics that we have then carry over when you're dealing with a different population, those who are detained for violations of immigration law, which is civil law. But this lack of understanding about lawbreaker versus lawbreaker and how we characterize risk, which is appreciably different when you're talking about certain who are in the felon category from those who have come or stayed contrary to law. It's a big deal difference.
I'm going to turn to questions in just a second. And Dora very kindly referred to my comments as preamble, because I always have a lot of preamble, I'm afraid. But is there, the paper's on the issue largely of kind of the U.S. influence on other countries, and do either of you ever see it run the other way? I mean, is the U.S. ever learning about good practices and trying to apply good practices from other places, or is that not Or are there not good practices in other places? Or, I mean, I wonder if you could speak to that issue. And Dora, I also promised this would be my last question, so I'll ask a two-part question. Could you share that one standard that you think would go a long way towards the 700 pages of standards that we have now, if only it was adopted? Because I think that'll give people a sense of just the kind of challenge that faces the immigrant detention system.
There are, to go to one of the earlier questions, post-preamble, but not the last question. In the corrections world, the United States has been very favorably impacted by a lot of the work that has gone on for a number of years in the United Kingdom. Indeed, halfway houses and all manner of community supervision were adapted from work that they had observed in the United Kingdom. And the Scandinavian countries have also been very progressive and have informed corrections practice. And I'm not as conversant as the good practices that are shaping the civil conversation, but to the extent that we learned from the correction side and apply them now, when we envision, for example, where detention is necessary, and by necessary I mean because there's been objectively assessed identification of risk to the community, either in terms of failure to appear or a propensity to commit crimes if left in an unsupervised situation. The facility's purpose is primarily to hold individuals for the shortest amount of time possible pending a determination of relief or removal, and that for some groups that have opportunities to be reconsidered, for example, asylum seekers having passed certain critical thresholds, that these questions be revisited again and that they be reconsidered for release when it's no longer statutorily prohibited. That these would be more normalized places because civil detainees are appreciably different as a population than those who are held on criminal charges. They're far more likely to have taken care of themselves and a family, to have really practiced good decision making. They know how to cook meals and earn a living in a lawful way, and so the need to impose all of that control on them is unnecessarily and also then extremely inexpensive. I've been directly involved. I've been really privileged to be involved in the crafting of standards that the American Bar Association has promulgated for civil detainees, and we've actually, Karen is in the back and has been very involved as well in most recently continuing to amend those standards, for example, to speak to issues that are hot in the correctional arena, such as solitary confinement or punitive segregation. But if we adopted just one standard, and it gets back to the question of law, which you asked early on, which is such a critical question, if all that we did at the minimum, and so we shouldn't stop there, but at the minimum, if we were to say as a society that a civil detainee would be treated no worse than we would by law treat a pretrial detainee, by and large we would vastly improve the conditions of their detention for the length of their detention. And again, because the case law is so much richer, in fact, because corrections has failed for that much longer, and so it's been, before the Supreme Court on a number of occasions. But if we just adopted all of those policies and practices for the civil detainee, it would make an appreciable difference. That is not to suggest that is where we should stop or would stop, but it would immediately raise the
platform from which all the reforms would come?
I think there's a couple things I could say about the United States case in this regard. I mean, having done a lot of our work, initial work, focusing on European countries and being based in Europe, it's always, it doesn't come as a surprise to anybody here, I'm sure, but I always have to sort of relearn how I think about things when I come to the United States, because there is no aspirational international impact on what's going on here. What I mean by that is, whereas in Europe you have actual legal structures in place that are supranational in the form of the Council of Europe, for instance, that have authority to visit all of the places of detention and all of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe and critique those practices repeatedly every couple of years. And the state responds to that advocacy that's based on a treaty about the appropriate treatment of detainees. That's completely absent in the United States context. It just doesn't exist. And one of the things you highlighted in your 2009 report was this issue of oversight and how it works. And when you read that, what's striking about that is there's no discussion of, here's the Committee for the Prevention of Torture of the Organization of American States and how that could provide some mechanism for spreading policies that are more humane, for instance. That is at play in Europe to a great extent, and also in some other regions of the world, in particular in Africa. So you have these regional mechanisms and some international mechanisms in lots of countries in the world. Most of the world appeals to them and is influenced by them on some level. That's absent in the United States case. On the other hand, I know that Immigration and Customs Enforcement under the Obama administration has gone to great lengths to seek out ideas from international actors about how do you do alternatives to detention, what are appropriate. And so I know that there has been this discussion. The extent to which they have impacted decision making is I can't speak to, but I do know that that has happened, perhaps much more so during the Obama administration.
Thank you. Okay, questions, comments? We have mics, yes. Maybe speak into the mics because this is being recorded.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please, yes.
Good morning, Groni O'Hara. I'm from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And thanks to both of you for your very interesting and insightful comments. I'm looking very much forward to reading your report, Michael, your publication, because it reads like the last 20 years of my work with UNHCR. I mean, it just reads like a trajectory of everything I've worked on and everything that I've observed. Of course, UNHCR, our interest in detention is quite specific because we're looking at the interests of asylum seekers and refugees within the broader context of migration. But what echoed very strongly to me from your comments was this whole notion of criminalization of migration, and within that, the criminalization of asylum and how that impacts on people's ability to exercise their rights. So 3 quick observations. And if I may, responding first to you, Donald, in terms of best practices and where people take their guidance from. UNHCR has just last month launched our new policy on beyond detention. It's a policy to run from 2014 to 2019 with a specific emphasis on trying to stop the detention of asylum-seeking children. And the US is one of the pilot countries for this, so we hope that to some degree the US authorities will be taking some guidance and leadership from what UNHCR has to say and what we've observed globally. Accompanying that, we have now a massive 220-page manual on immigration, monitoring of immigration detention, which reflects the fact that we as UN officials working with asylum seekers, we spend more and more of our time in detention centres, which was not the case when I started 20 years ago, which is why I say what you're saying really echoes back to me of what I've observed in my own career. And if I could just quickly responding or making some comments on things that Michael said. I mean, you alluded, Michael, to the whole question of how the expansion of detention impacts on people's ability to exercise, to enjoy certain fundamental rights. And of course, for us, the underlying basic concept of access to asylum is very much impacted both by the interception measures and by the detention measures, which in our view run directly contrary to international law obligations, both Article 33 on non-refoulement and Article 31 on non-penalisation for illegal entry. I was also very much struck by what you were saying and the examples you were citing about how the expansion of policies without necessarily thinking of their implications, and I'm thinking primarily of the policies of interdiction and detention, without thinking through their implications, the sort of impact they have at the other end. And thinking of your example of, increased use of detention in places like Mauritania, I mean, it's often UNHCR colleagues that end up on the receiving end of trying to process the asylum claims of people that end up in detention as a result of migration control measures in countries that previously did not have detention policies, and in parallel in countries that don't have asylum policies. So what happens to people is they end up in indefinite detention because there is no alternative. We see this in places like Mauritania, we see it now more dramatically in Libya, which has become the main transit route to Europe, and we see it also in places like the impact of the outposted, different countries use different titles, but I know that one of the titles that's used for the overseas implementation of migration control is the immigration integrity officers, and we see that the impact of officers like that in places like Moscow airport, where people are prevented from traveling further and then end up in indefinite detention. And so these were just some of the comments that struck me. And perhaps the last one, in terms of the whole notion of international burden sharing and solidarity, I was very struck by what you said about Turkey and the focus now on Turkey as part of potential candidate country measures, that Turkey would be a focus for readmission, because there you see a country that's currently receiving a massive crisis. It's at the receiving end of now close to 1 million Syrians, and what we tend to see with these type of refugee crises is it's only a short space of time before people start to move on irregularly. So potentially some of the people that would be moving on from Turkey would be the Syrian refugees, between the Syrians and the Palestinians. And then you see the contradiction of policies which, that you look at a country like Turkey and you think, okay, what kind of burden sharing does Turkey need? And the last thing Turkey is going to need is pressure for the readmission of tens or potentially hundreds of Syrians, when Turkey is actually currently hosting close to 1 million Syrians.
Thank you for the comments. I mean, you filled out some of the other parts that are in the paper, actually. So.
And I'm very much looking forward to reading it.
I'll just comment on your comments. Just one particular thing I would note, the case of Turkey is quite remarkable, right? Because as you point out, the issue of the numbers of refugees from Syria in that country has grown tremendously. And despite that, they still saw the need to sign this readmission agreement with EU. It's rather remarkable. It points to the incredible need these countries see in becoming a part of that economic union, that they would go to those lengths. But thank you for the comments.
Yes, please come up to the microphone, and you all can line up if you'd like. Thank you. And if you could identify yourself too.
Okay, hi, my name is Sarah Stern. I'm here from Israel, and I run an adult education program for refugees, asylum seekers, and undocumented migrants. The Israeli government has very recently implemented a detention policy, just about 6 months ago, and it's still in development. I'm very much aware of the inside kind of policy and how it's run inside the center currently. And I'm just interested in hearing what the typical conditions are within the facilities elsewhere, in the United States or in Europe. Length of detention, freedom to leave the facility, services such as health or education, who typically runs the detention center. Thank you.
I'll start with the United States. The
There's some 35,000 beds that are utilized there across the United States. Only a few have been specifically built with civil detainees in mind. The vast majority were built as jails or prisons, so they were intended to be hardened and secure correctional facilities. The conditions of detention are changing, and in general for the better, but many would say not as many facilities have been affected and not as fast as many would like to see. As we move towards a newer type of facility, consistent with how I describe the population as folks who have taken care of themselves and their families and have been somewhat successful in their lives. There is more freedom of movement in the facilities, there is more natural light, there's more access to the outdoors, there is greater opportunity for staying in contact with family, and so the ability to have access by phone, by contact visitation versus indirect visitation. In several facilities, talk of even access by email. So in those ways, more normalized. The programs are very much modeled after core correctional facilities, and that's again driven by correctional case law. So there's some access to legal research. The languages are quite limited in which that material is available. There is some access to religious activity, but again, somewhat limited. The food is still largely institutional in its service. Included in my report's recommendation was the ability for people to be able to prepare their own food for themselves and their families and use seasonings that would be more familiar to them as examples. So the physical plant is very much something that's in process. Healthcare was a big concern in the report, and I think it continues to be to some extent. So just as we've talked about objective assessments of risk to be in a facility or to be supervised in the community, timely medical assessments as well as mental health assessments, particularly for people who stay longer in a secure setting, being unfamiliar with that setting, and are things that the reports speak about, and I think people in this room still share concerns about as well.
Sarah? Is it Sarah? Yeah. So the case of Israel is we've looked at it previously, and we have a report on Israel that was published previous to these most recent reforms. So I won't go into detail, but you could take a look at what some of our analysis has looked like, looking at Israel and comparing it to other countries. But you listed a number of different things you're interested in knowing more about: conditions, mandatory or not, who runs detention facilities, length of detention. And ultimately the variations that one finds in detention regimes. And I think I'm not exaggerating when I say that the variations are basically commensurate with the number of countries in the world. It's a tremendously diverse phenomena. Between Israel and Lebanon, there are going to be some incredibly large variations, right? For instance, even though they're neighbors. And they have a variety of different reasons why they're detaining people. What are the pressures and what's the nature of that pressure? I would highlight a couple things. You asked, well, who are running detention facilities? And in fact, this is a very interesting question when you look at the issue globally. Not only who's running the facilities, but who has custody over the people in those facilities. Because that is an evolving phenomena, and you find so many different actors involved. from country to country to country. One of the things that we try to do in building data on detention regimes is we code facilities for what we call custodial authority. What is the agency that basically has the dossier of those individuals in that facility? We came up with the typology of ministry types to begin to create an empirical evidentiary base about this conversation on securitization, where I don't know to what extent the audience will be familiar with the conversation on securitization, but simplified, it basically means how do certain issues become a security concern, or defined as one. And you can begin to look at this by simply looking at who's running the facilities and who has custody over these. What are the ministries that are involved in this? And it can run the gamut from social affairs ministries to national defense ministries to ministries that are devoted to penitentiary issues to the justice ministry, the interior ministry, the whole gamut. You know, from country to country to country, you see these variations. And the variations alone raise questions, right? I mean, why is it that this particular country has emphasized this particular oversight of the treatment of detainees? And that leads to some pretty interesting analysis that one can do on a comparative level. In terms of conditions of detention, again, that varies tremendously. In some cases, we find in Switzerland, for example, the better run detention facilities allow the people there to prepare their own meals, as you discussed. And when you walk in these detention facilities, the one outside Geneva, for instance, where I live, you get the sense that you're in a camp, a day camp. You know, they're free to be outside, inside. They're free to play ping pong, smoke cigarettes, make their meals when they want to make their meals from 8 to 8, right? So, but this is a facility that houses 25 people. So when you're housing 25 people as opposed to 200 people, your ability to have a better set of circumstances for those people, it's much easier, right? On the other hand, there are other facilities in Switzerland where people are under lockdown 24 hours a day, right? Okay, good. So in any case.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Sarah.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Rosengart, and I work with the United Nations Development Program, and I find this extremely fascinating. And it evokes a lot of reflections in the context of the discussion on migration and development that is ongoing, and where I think we're trying to highlight a lot the kind of benefits of international cooperation and actually the kind of experience sharing among countries that is facilitated through regional consultative processes and the Global Forum on Migration, Development, and so on. And I think it's quite interesting to look at it the other way around, you know, like what kind of practices are being shared as well. And you have now, for example, in the latest draft of the Open Working Group, which was finalized on Saturday, you have language on, and I think everybody was quite happy, but you have language on, we want to facilitate well-managed, planned migration policies, responsible migration policies. And I think that leaves a lot of room for interpretation by states of what they mean with that at the end of the day. So my questions are basically around those reflections. One is, what is the role that you see for these regional consultative processes and these kind of informal fora of states for this diffusion of practices? And what role do you see for anti-human trafficking policies and programs in the diffusion of this kind of practices? And then for Ms. Schriro, I was wondering, in terms of the policy coherence argument that Don also touched upon, what is the space, or what change would be needed in administration to actually be able to reflect better upon the links between different policies towards certain regions or countries? I'm thinking of, we're working with Jamaica, for example, on their national migration and development policy, and they have a lot of concerns around deportation and how to address the return or reintegration of those people. I think they're working a little bit with the UK government on that, but not with the US or with Canada, for example. And I think especially now in the context of minors coming here and the whole question of gang violence, I think it's not new to talk about, what role has deportation from the US had. And I'm not trying to simplify and say, well, it's all just the US that is to blame. But obviously there are linkages also between the war on drugs and so on. And I'm wondering what is the capacity of the administration to actually reflect upon this in an integrated manner and to kind of change also practices on that basis.
Maybe we should have Mark ask, and then we can, because we're winding down here. Mark, why don't you ask, and then we'll respond to both sets of questions.
Hi, Mark Nofri, American Immigration Council, and formerly a fellow here. So, Dr. Schriro, you mentioned evidence-based risk assessments, and I wanted to ask you both about your views on that. So, I've been doing some research for Dawn on risk assessments, and I think the concerns we have is that even with the risk assessments, detention may not be changing so much so far, and that over-supervision may also be continuing, as it has in some criminal justice reforms with that too. So I think my question to you, Dr. Schriro, is could you talk a little more about how you see risk assessment working in the immigration context, how it should work, and and maybe a little more about how it might be different in immigration than criminal justice. And I think, Michael, I'm interested as to how you view risk assessment. Do you view it as a constructive reform or window dressing, as some of the other reforms that you mentioned?
Why don't we take all the questions, and then this will be it, the last two questions.
Thank you. My name is Emeka Christian Obios from Augustinians International. I also thank other speakers for their presentation today and for CMS for organizing this. I want to respond to the global dimension of detention, especially when it happens between countries where one country uses another as channel of returning migrants. And I speak on the region of the Mediterranean, where we have the African and the European. The particular experience that happened with Libya during the Libya crisis still speaks to the deficiencies of some of these approaches that have been used in returning migrants from one country to another. Libya had collaborated with some governments of Europe to be a channel through which some Africans are returned to their places. And the experience in Libya was that they were not returned to their homes. They were left in Libya, and many of them wound up being used as forced fighters during the Libya crisis. So I want to ask Michael if current research has found what is the current practice in way of seeing that these migrants who are being returned from or stopped from crossing over Europe are returned safely to their places, and how this has happened in recent time.
Okay, thanks. We're kind of at the end, so if we could just have one more question then.
Okay, one more question.
Well, I meant the person behind you, but that's okay. If you have a quick one.
Yeah, a quick one. I'm doing this particularly responding to New York and the migration issue. I mean, I'm here with a license which was issued to me by New York licensing office as a migrant in New York, and I have a license issued to me by Toronto licensing office as a migrant in Toronto. There's something different between these two licenses, which I began to observe recently. You know, the one of New York has my data as when I came to New York and who I am. And the one of Canada has nothing about it. The problem is the link between traffic offense and migration issue. If I'm stopped for any reason violating traffic offense in New York or any part of the US, somebody immediately goes to my identity or my status in the US. So whether New York operates using one means to also implement the issues of migrants' rights, I think
Okay, we
have to-
really have to, because we're at the very end of the time, so we have to turn to the folks to answer the three sets of questions. Thank you very much.
All right, so what one policy? That's a wonderful question. If I was going to propose one thing that would make a big difference quickly, it would be, right now Congress appropriates monies to Homeland Security for ICE for the purpose of detention, and the language, I'm paraphrasing, but the expectation is that the ICE will spend all of those monies and keep all of those beds open. And so, to Michael's point about if alternatives to incarceration only widen the net, those, just rounding out what I think was implied, then what you have is a bigger system. You have more people under supervision. Although the beds haven't gotten any bigger, they haven't gotten any smaller. And so it kind of leads into the other question about evidence-based risk assessments and what good is it to have something that's accurate if it's used inappropriately. And so if all that we needed to, if we assessed that there were so many people who presented risk, real risk to the public in terms of the likelihood of committing crimes, serious crimes, presenting real risk of failing to appear for scheduled appearances, that if we only maintain those numbers of beds and not kept all beds open and filled, then that one change in policy would make an immediate and measurable change here in the States. So to finish the question about the risk assessment instrument, it's critical that you have something that's a good predictor of human conduct, which is always dicey at best, but it can be done with reasonable accuracy. But being clear about what risk is. And so I go back to my earlier observation about detention being staffed primarily by enforcement personnel. And it's interesting, shortly after my study came out, the unit that I was studying was called Detention and Removal Operations. It was referred to as DRO. And probably of all the things they did, one of the things they did first, and I hadn't recommended it, which was, I thought, also interesting, is they renamed themselves as Enforcement and Removal Operations. So they were, they were indirectly affirming the observation that they were enforcement people doing other kind of work. And so, when you hear people in government or elsewhere describing, in general, the alien population as dangerous, and characterizing everybody who's either in those detention facilities or under community supervision as the worst of the worst. But as I pointed out in my study and many studies since then, that there are relatively few who have committed at any time in their lives a UCR Part 1 crime. So you'll have a number of people who have some record, but it's usually dealing with traffic violations, which is something of the point of the gentleman who was last to ask the question. And so, what really is the worst of the worst? And so it's not just having a good instrument, but then aligning it with your stated public policy, which is to protect the public and to only have people who need that extra supervision pending relief or removal to be in those circumstances. The other thing that I would suggest is to the extent that some people are going to receive relief, and depending on how the discussion now goes also with the unaccompanied minors as to whether they'll be able to stay either in some foster care situation or be reunited with family who are here lawfully in the country, is to think about adopting yet another correctional practice, but again with the civil detainee in mind. and that is what is necessary to achieve a successful reentry. Reentry is a reform that the corrections world has adopted these last 20 years. And so to the extent that people need to be prepared to be successful in the community, whether it's, again, because they're here now in some lawful status or because they're still waiting a decision about removal or release, that we ought to be thinking about reentry for this group as well.
Just really quickly, there's a number of questions out there. I'll address a few of them as quickly as I can. With respect to the issue of the regional and intergovernmental consultative processes and what role they have played in this effort, I think one of the problems with really answering that question is that you often don't know what's going on in those meetings. I think that the consultative process that the United States has carried on with its neighboring countries throughout the 1990s no doubt played an important role in the creation of these anti-smuggling interdiction efforts, multilateral efforts that were that they launched in the late 1990s. I'm sure that those were arranged in those processes, but I can't really speak to it because I don't know if anyone's actually seen inside these conversations. Regarding the issue of risk assessments, risk assessment can be window dressing, but I think in other respects, as long as you have a country that does not have mandatory detention, and I speak very specifically to the issue of the European Union, which with its returns directive has made mandatory detention unlawful, risk assessments become a very important role because you have to do an assessment of, most importantly, whether or not you think the person's going to abscond or not. That's the most important element of the risk assessments that are done in these countries. And that serves as the first basis for which people will or will not be detained. So it's very important that those exist. Just lastly, the issue raised by the gentleman about Libya, about returns and what do we know about returns and whether people get returned safely to their home countries. Actually, this is a really big gap. I think looking at this issue internationally, we often don't know what people are being returned to. We don't. And there have been some studies looking at specific kinds of countries in the context of Australia. Some researchers have done very good work looking at what happens to people when they've been returned to Afghanistan, when they've been returned to Iran. And it's not a pretty picture that you often find. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And let me just say really quickly to Grania, I think everybody looks at UNHCR for standards on detention, and particularly detention of asylum seekers and guidelines. What I was actually talking about was funding projects that actually prevent people from having to migrate. That's what I was talking about. And a good example of that is the $3.7 billion that is part of the Obama supplemental appropriation to deal with this, crisis. 8% of that goes to those types of conditions. 8% out of 3.7 billion. So that's what I was talking about in our inability to kind of lift up good development practices that would prevent people from having to migrate. But anyway, let me thank very much Michael and Dora for being here. It was a great conversation, and thank all of you as well.